I'm Abby Montford, and this is going to be my presentation on metaphysical poetry that we're doing for, obviously, our Brit Lit class. The poet that I picked for this presentation is Ben Jonson, and we'll talk about him and his background and his poetry further along into this, but first we're going to talk about what metaphysical poetry is and its characteristics and what it's all about. So metaphysical poetry is often defined as a form of poetry, or how the poet writes, and it's poems that stimulate your intellectual thought using conceit, irony, and wit. Metaphysical poems generally revolve around religion, love, and morality. Metaphysical works were also known for philosophical exploration, so they kind of were designed to make you think a little bit deeper, to actually use your brain and just have deep intellectual thoughts about what this poem means. Often they're not very long, some of them are, but they're shorter and kind of not really straight to the point, because they really want you to think about what they're trying to say, but they use a lot of different types of poetry, different meter, different types of language to create drama and tension along in their poems. So often they also use colloquial diction and metrically flexible lines. And colloquial diction is the use of informal expressions or slang, and metrically flexible lines are lines that don't necessarily follow a main type of meter or pattern of strong and weak syllables like regular poems do. And poets use these different types of meter to create that drama and create that tension that they're going for, and they often use metaphors, puns, and paradoxes along with those, just to, again, really make you think about what you're reading and have an intellectual thought about what they're trying to get to you. And now Ben Jonson is the metaphysical poet that I picked, and a little bit about his life and his background. First of all, Ben Jonson was not necessarily known for being a metaphysical poet right off the bat. He was instead known in his time as an excellent playwright. He wrote lots of plays that turned in productions with lots of famous actors of his time starring as his lead roles, including William Shakespeare was a lead role in one of his plays. But he was later defined and categorized as metaphysical by Samuel Johnson. But Ben Jonson was born on June 11th in 1572 in Westminster, United Kingdom. He attended St. Martin's Parish School and Westminster School, and while he was in his schooling, he fell in love with classic literature, and his love for literature when he was in school would lead him to decide he wanted to write poetry, and would end up being one of his major inspirations for the poetry that he wrote after reading all the classical literature in school. Jonson eventually left school in 1589 to follow in his stepfather's footsteps of bricklaying. He took a little break and decided he wanted to lay some bricks with his stepfather, but after that he joined the military. And all these things in his life would eventually lead him to becoming an actor and a playwright for Philip Pinslow's theater company. Not much is known about his personal life or his marital life, other than he was married to a woman, and this is the only marriage that they know of, that historians know of for him. But he was married to a woman named Anne Lewis in 1594, and it's thought that they had at least 2 children together, and neither one of these children ended up surviving. The daughter that he had that they know of died when she was still a baby, and then his son lived to be about 7 years old, and the poem that I chose to talk about for this project is actually written about his son after he passed away. So his children were big inspirations for his poetry. But his first great play was titled Every Man in His Humor in 1589. And this play would eventually become a production in 1616, in which William Shakespeare would end up acting as one of his lead roles. And not too long after the play opened, Ben was actually arrested for the murder of a man named Gabriel Spencer during a duel. But Jonson was later released because the jury that was chosen for his trial was deadlocked and they couldn't decide on a verdict for him. And in the end, he ended up being released from prison because he could read and write in Latin. So how times have changed. All you had to be able to do was read and write in Latin to get out of prison. But he ended up spending a few weeks in jail before they released him, and then was arrested again for failing to pay one of his actors. But I would assume he got out of that too. He would continue on over the next 15 years and create some of his most famous satirical plays, which were Volpone in 1606 and The Alchemist in 1610. This is kind of what he was most known for, was these plays rather than his poetry. But again, later on he would be defined as a metaphysical poet. And these plays end up being produced for the London stage. And Jonson actually from these plays had a circle of admirers or friends that would meet up regularly at local taverns, and they called themselves the Tribe of Ben. So he was a pretty popular guy, and some of the people in this group included the Duke and Duchess of Newcastle, and writers including Robert Herrick, Richard Lovelace, Sir John Suckling, James Howell, and Thomas Carew. Jonson was also friends with many writers in his day, and many of his most well-known poems are tributes to some of these friends, such as Shakespeare, John Donne, and Francis Bacon. He used his friendships with them to actually be his inspiration for a lot of his most famous poems. So they must have been pretty good friends to him. Jonson is often identified as England's first poet laureate and is seen as one of the major dramatists and poets of the 17th century. And in August of 1637, Ben Jonson passed away in Westminster after suffering a series of numerous strokes. And after people heard of his passing, there was actually a crowd of mourners and admirers that attended his burial at the Westminster Abbey. And so the poem that I chose from Ben Jonson to explicate on is called On My First Son. This poem is not very long. It's only a few lines, but in these few lines, he managed to show extreme sadness and grief over the passing of his 7-year-old son, as we mentioned earlier. And this poem begins with Jonson kind of telling his son goodbye and saying, you're gone now. And then he goes on to kind of blame himself for his son's untimely death. He alludes to the thought that he had hoped too much and had hoped of too bright of a future for his son, and that was why he must have been returned to the heavenly place that he came from. And he uses the words that his son was lent to him. He says that he was lent to me in the second line, as though his son never really belonged to him, but rather maybe to God or some other kind of religious being that Ben Jonson, believed in. And I think that says a lot, that especially in this type of poetry, that as it is often about religion or love or morality, that he acts as if, his son was a gift to him from someone else, and that it was such a tragedy that he was taken away so soon. And then after that, Jonson goes on to seem like he kind of envies his son that he's passed away, saying, why should he feel sad that his son has passed away when his son is free of pain and suffering, and he'll never have to feel sad or experience the sadness of kind of growing old. And with no answer to this question, he goes on in the poem to ask that the child's grave record that his son was his best piece of poetry, meaning that of all the things and productions that he created and produced and wrote, that his son and raising his son for those 7 short years was what he was the most proud of, and it was kind of what he wanted to be known for, was that, he had created this life and raised this human, and that was what he was the most proud of, no matter how famous he was for his plays or his poems. The last lines of the poem are Jonson's kind of vows to himself that he was going to tread lightly with who he loves, and that he'll try to not like and need them so much for fear of losing someone else that meant so much to him. So this whole poem, in the few lines that it is, how short it is, I think it says a lot for a poet to be able to convey that kind of emotion and kind of put that kind of message out in such few words, to be able to make somebody feel that kind of pain and grief for somebody obviously that we have never met. But it's kind of relatable how he writes about it, about his son, and how like horrible this is, but you know, his son won't suffer anymore, but that he still wants everyone to know and for it to be known that his son was the proudest thing to him. So definitely a very emotional poem there, but of all the ones that I read of him, that was probably one of my favorite ones that I had found. I just think that it really makes you think about, you know, what he must have gone through as a father to lose his son that age and then write this beautiful poem about it. It's definitely very touching. So that's all about Ben Jonson and metaphysical poetry. Thank you for watching this, and hope everybody else did good on their projects.